All right, everyone, we have to talk about Ebola again because the number of new cases over each span of time has now doubled in the last couple of months. That should be worrying people more. You've got a situation where year over year the population density of virtually any part of Africa is increasing drastically, where you have very little in the way of domestic development going on. The West invests and then draws productivity back out mostly. Domestically, it's all still dirt roads and banyan trees and shit, and that's not a stereotype, literally. If you're looking at most of the Congo, there is no human development index. It's still quite as much as it was maybe 50, 100 years ago. That's it. And then you have this civil war going on, which is causing massive problems. Well, the problem is this. Healthcare workers have been attacked. They've had their stuff looted. Now, in some cases, you've just had an Ebola patient in this van. It's still covered in potentially non-sterile surfaces, and then, some rebels decide that van would be a good the post to fire from, and they get inside. Could be a recipe for disaster. And now, people have begun to avoid the health workers. I think the big concern probably is this. You're in an area that's, rocked by rebels. Even if you've got like the Ebola patients in your family, you might have to flee at a moment's notice. They want you to stay put in this clinic, this makeshift sort of area for treating the Ebola patients. It's like a big problem. Now, there is some promise being shown by a vaccine that's experimentally been developed. It looks like it may work 90% of the time. The problem being then, of course, are you going to inoculate the whole population of Africa? Because otherwise, you get one of these situations where you have local instability anyway. It could be a problem to mass deploy a vaccine retroactively once Ebola's already broken out. The very word Ebola causes panic. Like, I think, wasn't the Congo one of the nations that closed its borders too? Like Guinea and Liberia and some of these others during the last pandemic? And then they had their own mini epidemic as well at the time. And the biggest epidemic before that, I think, was in the Congo. Several thousand people died. It was probably about 20,000 people in the last one. And I'm going to tell you, one of the big reasons is distrust of the West, and the other big one is population density. You've got a massive population increase. Like the last time that they had a major epidemic back, I think it was in the mid-70s in the Congo, where it killed 2,000 people. That had been the biggest up till then in recorded history. Just think about how many fewer people were living in the Congo at the time, back in the 70s. You're talking almost a half a century ago. The population of some of these nations is literally skyrocketing. The whole region is ready for a major pandemic that could knock literally urban centers back to the Stone Age if it were to happen. All Western investment will flee. The situation will spiral out of control, and it will destroy what development has already gone on there. It is possible for that to happen because you've got these African nations. They have a small, wealthy business class that likes to travel a lot. You have people from the West traveling around as well. Instantaneous travel almost. Going from Nigeria to the Congo doesn't take a month like it used to by wagon or something, or a week by sea. Now it takes a couple of hours. And this is the problem. You've got a lot of trade and travel, and you've got a high population density, but you do not have a significant medical investment that's been made locally. It's still, why do you think Doctors Without Borders has to march in every time there's an Ebola outbreak? The local healthcare system doesn't have the ability to fight Ebola at all. 0% chance that they'll win. Well, now that you've got higher population density, it's not like back in the 50s or the 60s, Ebola would come in, wipe out a couple villages, and it'd be like, oh, that's rather sad, 500, 1,000 people died. Now it's more like it could spread out of control through an area that has become densely populated. We're talking all the way from the Sierra Leone-Guinea area across the whole scope of Western Africa down along almost to Gabon. That entire area is lit up like a Christmas tree when you look at a population density map. And it's still growing. No, trust me, it's not even remotely there yet. It'll be 10 times as populated within the next century, almost certainly. I don't think that growth will stop because you have migration in many cases. It's a big problem. The world should be thinking about ways to solve that issue when you're talking about pandemics breaking out because of that higher density. It could burn through 100,000 or a million people easily. It could literally knock back the Congo's entire development where it has become developed. It reached Butembo. They had that one case there. Thankfully, it didn't spawn apparently an epidemic in and of itself. but it reached one of these urban areas. Well, it's only a matter of time before it does that again. It's only a matter of time if you don't stop the epidemic that it hits a major urban center and does take hold. Then people, it would be chaos. Can you imagine? Ebola comes to the capital of the Congo or spreads to, I don't know, Lagos or something. People will lose their fucking marbles. Yeah, and even if it doesn't take off, people are like, oh, lock up your daughters, basically. Imagine if it does take off. People start fleeing from the countryside. You've already got rebels running around. You've got no infrastructural development, and you've got a population that is not as immune to disease anyway because it is more likely to be malnourished or overworked and then have generally a lower healthcare system, in the sense that there's little to nothing in the way of sanitation. Often, you have some small village, there might not be any clean water. Even a city. A lot of people in the cities in parts of Africa live in shanty towns, basically. Not recognizable as Western-style cities with like paved roads and stuff or electricity. It's basically just an area of higher concentration of population. Well, that's a breeding ground potentially for an epidemic. It's literally, it would be like looking at some of the outbreaks of disease in like, I don't know, London in the mid-1800s or something, or San Francisco after the earthquake, when in order to stop the plague, they had to pay people a bunch of money to kill all the rats that were pouring out of the ruined sewer lines, and like, we'll give you a penny per dozen rats or something, and then you could get a hot meal, I guess, because there's plenty of burning debris around to cook it on. That's basically what you see. You look back 100 years at some of the problems with contagion that the West had. Africa now has a worse problem. The density is higher, and the development is lower, so I don't know. People really need to start taking pandemics more seriously. One of the few things that could ever actually be positively impacted by global cooperation is medicine. It's probably the only legitimate use of the term globalism in a context that isn't pure evil. And then, of course, people won't work with the healthcare workers because they're like, oh, Bill Gates is going to give me autism or something like that. Here in the West, we've gotten so decadent. We've become a post-medicine society where increasingly the supposedly very, very erudite and intelligent left, like the master's degree kids, the trust fund gated community kids, are becoming a bunch of anti-vaxxers and saying, well, they don't really need that vaccine. Jimmy it doesn't matter if he gets the mumps, who fucking cares? We're living in a post-medicine society now. We've become victims of our own success. Meanwhile, they're like, oh, please give us those vaccines. And by the way, we want DDT because malaria is still the biggest problem, not only in Africa, but also in Asia, also in, I believe, Latin America. Malaria is the big problem, not Ebola. I think that it's flu that we should be the most worried about. It's mutation happy. It has spawned major pandemics before, Spanish flu, and again, the population density of the world was like, what, 1/10 what it was back then? Can you imagine how many people would die? Assuming, let's say that 10-15% of the world's population dies. That's not even anything like the death rate from anthrax or Ebola or something, or even like Marburg, I think. Imagine if 10% of the world's population were to keel over tomorrow. What would that be? Like 900 million people worldwide, I think. Isn't the world population about 9 billion? I don't know. I can't keep track. Maybe it's 10 billion or something. Maybe it's only 8. I don't know. Imagine that 10% of them die. For Rutland, that'd be like 2,500 people, in the metro area would be dead. You'd have to dig in a whole fucking new cemetery. Burlington's metro, it's like, 10,000 people died. Can you imagine about New York City? Oh yeah, there's 1 million, we need to dig 1 million graves, dude. Where you're going to have to do what you do with everything else that you don't want to do, which is offshore it to New Jersey. So New Jersey won't be the Garden State, although there will be plenty of people pushing up daisies at that point. That's about all. Peace out.